Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the version of yourself you've trusted for years no longer feels right. Not because you've failed, not because your life is falling apart, but because you're finally beginning to heal. Most people expect healing to feel like relief. They picture confidence replacing fear, peace replacing anxiety, and healthy relationships replacing emotional struggle. But for many dismissive avoidants, the first stage of healing feels nothing like that. It feels disorienting. Almost like your inner world is shifting beneath your feet. The habits that once made you feel safe suddenly begin to lose their grip. Pulling away doesn't feel as satisfying. Shutting down doesn't bring the same comfort. Convincing yourself that you don't need anyone starts to sound less convincing. And that's when the real challenge begins. You aren't just changing how you relate to people. You're changing the story you've believed about yourself for years. The person who always stayed in control. The person who never relied on anyone. The person who believed distance meant strength. When those beliefs begin to crack, it can feel as though you're watching an old version of yourself slowly disappear. That experience is deeply unsettling because our minds naturally cling to what's familiar, even when it's the very thing that's keeping us emotionally stuck. This is why so many avoidants mistake healing for losing themselves. In reality, they aren't losing their identity. They're losing the survival role they were forced to play. If you've ever found yourself pulling away just as life starts getting better, if emotional closeness feels strangely uncomfortable, or if becoming healthier has left you feeling confused instead of confident, don't click away. Because today we're uncovering one of the least understood parts of attachment healing, the identity crisis that often appears right before real transformation begins. And once you understand why it happens, you'll never look at your healing journey the same way again. Long before an avoidant ever struggles in a relationship, something much deeper has already taken shape. An identity. Not the identity they were born with, but the one they slowly constructed to survive. It rarely happens overnight. As a child, they may have discovered that expressing fear, sadness, or emotional needs didn't bring comfort. Instead, it brought disappointment, criticism, rejection, or silence. So without even realizing it, they began making an unconscious decision. If my feelings don't matter, I'll stop depending on anyone. That decision wasn't just emotional. It became personal. Over time, they stopped seeing independence as something they practiced. They started believing it was who they were. They became the person who never needed help, the one who always handled problems alone, the one who stayed calm while everyone else became emotional, the one who valued logic over feelings and space over closeness. From the outside, this identity often looks impressive. People describe avoidance as confident, composed, self-sufficient, and emotionally strong. But beneath that image is a quieter truth. Much of that strength was built as protection, not preference. The walls weren't created because closeness had no value. They were created because closeness once felt unpredictable. Eventually, the protective mask becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like a mask at all. It feels like personality. It feels like character. It feels like the real self. That's why healing becomes so confusing. When a therapist, a loving partner, or life itself begins challenging those old defenses, it doesn't simply feel like changing habits. It feels like someone is asking you to become a completely different person. And that's why many avoidants resist growth. Not because they don't want connection, but because the identity they've spent years building has become inseparable from the way they see themselves. The greatest surprise is this: you were never your defenses. You were simply forced to wear them for so long that they started to feel like your name.
One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment is that people assume emotional distance is simply a habit. It isn't. After years of repeating the same protective behaviors, emotional distance stops feeling like something you do. It starts feeling like who you are. Think about it. If you've spent most of your life convincing yourself that needing no one is strength, eventually you stop questioning it. You begin introducing yourself to the world through that belief. I'm just very independent. I'm not an emotional person. I like my space. I've always been this way. Those statements may feel true, but they're often the final layer of a much older survival strategy. The human brain loves familiarity. When a behavior protects us from pain over and over again, it eventually labels that behavior as part of our identity. The protection becomes automatic, almost invisible. That's why many avoidants genuinely believe they're simply wired differently.
But look a little closer. Notice how quickly they change the subject when conversations become emotionally deep. Notice how uncomfortable they feel when someone consistently shows love without demanding anything in return. Notice how they instinctively retreat after moments of genuine closeness, even when the relationship is healthy. These aren't random personality traits. They're emotional reflexes that have been practiced so many times they now feel completely natural. The irony is that emotional distance can become so comfortable that closeness begins to feel unnatural. Peace feels suspicious. Consistency feels boring. Being emotionally seen feels strangely unsafe. So instead of asking, "Why am I pulling away?" the mind asks, "Why is this person trying to change who I am?" That's the real conflict. Healing isn't asking you to abandon your personality. It's asking you to separate your authentic self from the protective habits that quietly took over your identity. Because beneath every carefully maintained wall is someone who was never born afraid of connection. They simply learned that distance was the safest place to stand. And when that lesson is repeated for years, even loneliness can begin to feel more familiar than love. Here's the paradox that almost nobody talks about. Most avoidants don't fear love. They fear what love will require from them. From the outside, becoming securely attached sounds like the ultimate goal. More trust, more intimacy, more emotional safety, a healthier relationship. Who wouldn't want that? But inside the mind of an avoidant, security doesn't always look comforting. It looks unfamiliar. And the human brain often mistakes unfamiliarity for danger. Imagine standing at the edge of a life you've never lived before. A life where you actually let someone see your fears. Where you don't automatically withdraw after conflict. Where you ask for reassurance instead of pretending you're fine. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, those behaviors can feel completely unnatural. Not because they're weak, because they're new. The hidden fear isn't, "What if this relationship fails?" It's, "What if I succeed and I have to become someone I've never known?" That question can be more frightening than heartbreak itself. Because becoming secure means giving up the illusion that you must handle everything alone. It means admitting that strength isn't measured by emotional distance, but by the courage to remain present when every instinct tells you to disappear. And that's where the internal battle begins. One part of you longs for deeper connection. Another part whispers, "Don't get too close. Don't depend on anyone. Don't risk getting hurt again." Neither voice is trying to destroy you. One is trying to help you grow. The other is trying to protect the version of you that survived yesterday. The problem is that survival and healing don't always speak the same language. Survival says, stay where it's familiar. Healing says, step toward what's healthier. Every time an avoidant chooses openness over withdrawal, honesty over silence, or connection over isolation, those two voices collide. That's why progress can feel so exhausting. You're not just changing behaviors, you're negotiating with years of emotional conditioning that still believes safety lives behind closed doors. The beautiful truth is this: the fear you're feeling isn't proof that you're making a mistake. It's often proof that you're walking beyond the limits of the life your defenses created and toward the relationships your authentic self has quietly wanted all along. For someone with a secure attachment style, vulnerability is often seen as a bridge. It's the path that brings two people closer together. But for many avoidants, vulnerability feels less like a bridge and more like stepping off a cliff. Not because they don't have emotions. In fact, many avoidants experience emotions deeply. They simply learned that showing those emotions came with a cost. Maybe they were ignored when they cried. Maybe they were expected to solve their own problems too early. Maybe expressing fear or sadness was met with criticism instead of comfort. Over time, they made a silent promise to themselves. No one will ever see me that exposed again. That promise became part of their identity. So when healing invites them to become emotionally open, it doesn't feel like adding a new skill. It feels like breaking a lifelong contract with themselves. Imagine spending years believing that your emotional walls are the very reason you've survived. Then one day, someone tells you those same walls are preventing the life you truly want. Wouldn't part of you hesitate? That's exactly what happens. The moment an avoidant starts saying things like, "I miss you," "I need your support," or "that hurt me," an uncomfortable thought often follows. This doesn't feel like me anymore. But here's the truth. It doesn't feel unfamiliar because it's wrong. It feels unfamiliar because you've spent so many years practicing emotional protection that openness now feels like becoming a stranger. There's another layer to this that few people recognize. Avoidants often confuse vulnerability with dependence. They fear that if they let someone matter too much, they'll lose their freedom, their control, or even their sense of self. They imagine closeness as something that slowly erases individuality. But healthy vulnerability doesn't take away your independence. It gives your independence a place to rest. Real emotional safety isn't about becoming emotionally dependent on another person. It's about knowing you no longer have to carry every burden alone. The greatest irony is this: the version of yourself you're afraid of losing was never your true identity. It was the armor. And while armor can protect you during a battle, it was never meant to become your skin. Healing begins the moment you realize that removing the armor doesn't make you weaker. It finally allows the real you to breathe. There comes a moment in every avoidance healing journey that feels almost impossible to explain. Nothing around you has dramatically changed, but everything inside you has. It's the strange space between who you used to be and who you're becoming. And honestly, it can feel incredibly unsettling. For years, your mind knew exactly how to respond whenever relationships became emotionally intense. Pull back. Stay busy. Convince yourself you don't care. Create distance before anyone gets too close. Those reactions weren't conscious decisions anymore. They became automatic. They gave your life a sense of certainty, even if that certainty kept you emotionally isolated. Then healing begins. You pause before withdrawing. You notice your instinct to shut down. You stay in conversations that you once would have escaped. And suddenly, something unexpected happens. Your old patterns no longer feel completely right, but your new way of responding doesn't feel natural yet either. You're standing between two identities. The old version feels familiar but limiting. The new version feels hopeful but uncertain. This is the identity crisis that so many avoidants experience but rarely talk about. You may even find yourself asking questions that seem impossible to answer. If I'm no longer the person who always walks away, who am I? If I let people matter to me, will I lose myself? What if becoming emotionally available changes everything I thought I knew about myself? These questions aren't signs that healing is failing. They're signs that your internal story is being rewritten. Think of it like renovating a house you've lived in your entire life. Before the new rooms are finished, the old walls have to come down. For a while, the house feels unfamiliar, messy, and incomplete. That doesn't mean it's falling apart. It means it's being rebuilt. The same is true for your identity. Healing doesn't erase your independence. It removes the fear that convinced you independence was your only option. Little by little, you stop defining yourself by how well you avoid emotional pain. Instead, you begin defining yourself by your ability to stay present, communicate honestly, and build relationships without abandoning yourself. And one day, almost without noticing, you'll realize something remarkable. You didn't lose your identity during healing. You uncovered the one that had been hidden beneath years of emotional survival all along. For many avoidants, secure attachment is imagined as a destination where fear completely disappears. But that's not what security feels like. Security isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to stop letting fear make every decision for you. That's an important difference. Many people assume that once they become securely attached, they'll never feel the urge to pull away again. They'll never overthink a relationship. They'll never feel overwhelmed by closeness. The truth is much more human. Old instincts may still whisper. The difference is that they no longer control your actions. A secure person doesn't run simply because intimacy feels uncomfortable. They become curious instead of reactive. Instead of asking, "How do I escape this feeling?" they ask, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" That small shift changes everything. Secure attachment also feels quieter than most people expect. There's less emotional chaos, less guessing, less testing whether someone really cares. You stop measuring love by intensity and start recognizing it through consistency. You no longer feel the need to disappear just to prove your independence. You no longer believe that every disagreement is the beginning of abandonment. You begin trusting that healthy relationships can survive honest conversations, uncomfortable emotions, and moments of imperfection. Perhaps the biggest surprise is that secure attachment doesn't erase your independence. It transforms it. You still enjoy your own space. You still have personal goals. You still value your individuality. The difference is that your independence is no longer fueled by fear. It's supported by confidence. You choose solitude because it refreshes you, not because you're protecting yourself from being hurt. And something else begins to change. You stop seeing vulnerability as a risk that weakens you. You begin seeing it as evidence that you're emotionally safe enough to be real. That doesn't mean every day feels effortless. It means you no longer abandon yourself whenever relationships become challenging. Real security is surprisingly ordinary. It isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It feels like being able to stay present when your old self would have walked away. It feels like breathing without constantly preparing for the next emotional storm. And one day, almost without realizing it, you'll notice something remarkable. The peace you spent years searching for wasn't waiting at the end of perfection. It was waiting on the other side of no longer needing to protect yourself from every possibility of pain. This is where many avoidants hesitate, because somewhere deep inside, there's a belief that sounds incredibly convincing. If I become emotionally available, I'll lose the part of me that makes me, me. It's one of the greatest myths that attachment wounds ever create. Healing doesn't ask you to give up your independence. It asks you to discover whether your independence was built on freedom or on fear. There's a huge difference. Healthy independence says, I enjoy my own company, but I also know it's okay to let people into my life. Fear-based independence says, if I let people get too close, I'll lose control, get hurt, or become trapped. At first glance, they can look almost identical, but their foundations couldn't be more different. One grows from confidence. The other grows from self-protection. As you begin healing, you'll notice something remarkable. You don't suddenly become someone who needs constant attention. You don't wake up craving reassurance every hour. You don't stop valuing your personal space. Instead, your relationship with independence begins to change. It no longer feels like a fortress you must defend every day. It becomes a peaceful place you can leave and return to without fear. You learn that closeness and freedom aren't competing forces. They're partners. You can deeply love someone without disappearing into them. You can ask for support without becoming dependent. You can set healthy boundaries without pushing people away. You can choose connection without sacrificing your individuality. That's what secure attachment quietly teaches. It doesn't replace your identity. It removes the fear that was pretending to be your identity. Slowly, your relationships begin to feel lighter. You stop keeping one foot out the door. You stop assuming every emotional conversation will end in disappointment. You stop treating love like a threat that has to be carefully managed. And perhaps the most beautiful transformation of all is this. You realize that the strongest version of yourself was never the one who needed no one. It was the one who could stand confidently on their own, while still allowing others to stand beside them. Because true independence isn't measured by how well you live without connection. It's measured by your ability to remain completely yourself, even while sharing your life with someone else. And that's not losing your freedom. That's finally discovering what real freedom has always looked like. If you've stayed with me until this point, I want you to remember one thing above everything else. The person you're becoming isn't replacing the person you were. They're revealing the person who was there all along. For years, you may have believed that your emotional distance, fierce independence, and need for control were simply part of your personality. They felt permanent because you'd carried them for so long. But survival has a way of disguising itself as identity. The longer we wear emotional armor, the more we mistake it for our own skin. Healing gently separates the two. It doesn't erase your strengths. It refines them. Your independence becomes confidence instead of isolation. Your calm becomes emotional stability instead of emotional suppression. Your boundaries become expressions of self-respect instead of walls built from fear. That's the transformation that secure attachment offers. Not a new personality, a more authentic one. There will still be moments when old habits call your name. There will be days when pulling away feels easier than staying present. There will be times when vulnerability feels risky. That doesn't mean you've gone backward. Growth is rarely a straight line. It's a series of choices that slowly become a new way of living. Every honest conversation, every moment you resist shutting down, every time you allow yourself to stay emotionally present, you're teaching your nervous system something it may have never truly believed before. Connection can be safe. And those 4 words have the power to change an entire life. One day, you'll look back and realize that the biggest breakthrough wasn't finding the perfect relationship. It was ending the constant battle with yourself. You'll notice that peace no longer feels unfamiliar. Closeness no longer feels threatening. Love no longer feels like a loss of freedom. Instead, it feels like a place where you can breathe without pretending to be someone else. So if you're standing in the uncomfortable space between your old identity and your new one, don't mistake the discomfort for failure. Sometimes the most confusing season of your life is simply the moment your authentic self begins to emerge. And when that happens, you don't become less of who you are. You finally become someone who no longer has to survive to deserve love. You simply allow yourself to receive it.